It had been 2 weeks since I moved into the small house on the outskirts of Jessup. I took a job teaching at a nearby school and was looking for a quiet place that was affordable and close to work. The house was a little too big for me, a two-bedroom with a detached garage and a small yard. It had been sitting on the market for nearly a year, which should have been my first red flag, but I convinced myself it was just luck. The neighborhood was quiet, mostly older folks or retired couples. I liked that. The first week was uneventful. I spent the nights unpacking boxes, hanging some pictures, and setting up my small office in the second bedroom. By the second week, everything was in its place, and a strange silence began to settle over the house when I wasn't actively doing something. It wasn't a peaceful kind of silence. It felt thick, like the house was listening. But I chalked it up to nerves and too many late nights alone. I'd never lived by myself before. The first incident happened on a Thursday night. I was grading papers in the living room. It was just past 10 p.m. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the hardwood floors settling. I had the TV on for background noise, some mindless cooking show I wasn't really watching. Suddenly, the volume on the TV went all the way up. Not gradually, instantly. It was deafening. I jumped and nearly knocked my laptop off the couch. I grabbed the remote and turned it down, but my hands were shaking. I assumed it was a glitch with the remote. I replaced the batteries. Maybe I'd leaned on it without noticing. Logical explanations. But I didn't sleep much that night. Friday passed without anything odd. I told a coworker about the TV thing during lunch, and she joked that my house was probably haunted. I laughed it off. People always say stuff like that about old houses. But that night, I heard knocking. It was subtle at first. I was already in bed, drifting between sleep and consciousness when I heard it. 3 soft knocks. I sat up and held my breath. It came again. Not on the front door or the back door. It was coming from inside the house. I got up, heart pounding, and checked every room. The kitchen, the hallway, the small laundry area by the back door. Everything was empty. I even went into the second bedroom and turned on the light. Nothing. I stood in the hallway for a while, listening. The knocking didn't come again. I tried to go back to sleep, but every sound, the wind against the window, the creak of the floor, the shifting of the house, made me jump. At some point, I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember was waking up to daylight pouring in through the blinds. Saturday, I decided I needed to get out of the house. I ran errands, went to the grocery store, drove aimlessly for a while. When I came home, the house looked exactly the same. Quiet, still, ordinary. I cooked dinner, watched a movie, and went to bed around midnight. I woke up to footsteps, not outside, not on the porch, inside. Slow, deliberate, soft steps. I held my breath and tried to convince myself I was dreaming. But I wasn't. I could hear them moving across the hallway, down the wooden floor. My bedroom door was cracked open, and I could see the dark hallway outside. The steps stopped just outside my door. I stared at the crack, waiting to see movement, waiting for anything. My body was frozen, and I couldn't even cry out. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours. Then, 3 knocks. Right on the door. I bolted upright, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I pressed my back to it, heart racing, skin cold. I grabbed my phone and called 911. I told them someone was in my house. The dispatcher stayed on the line while I waited in the room, barely breathing. Within 10 minutes, 2 officers arrived. They searched the house. Nothing. No sign of forced entry. All the doors and windows were locked from the inside. They told me it was probably just a nightmare, or maybe a raccoon on the roof. I knew better. Sunday morning, I seriously considered leaving. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and tried to think clearly. I had nowhere else to go, no family nearby, no close friends with a spare room. I didn't want to be dramatic. I told myself I'd give it one more night, just one more. That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I stayed up with every light in the house turned on. I sat on the couch, staring at the hallway, my phone in one hand and a kitchen knife in the other. It was after 3 a.m. when the lights flickered. All at once. They didn't go out completely, but they dimmed and flickered like the power was about to fail. Then I heard breathing. Heavy, rasping breathing, right behind me. I turned around so fast I knocked over a lamp. No one was there. The breathing stopped. I stood up and backed toward the wall, scanning the room. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the hallway wall, slow like it was crawling. I stared, wide-eyed, as it passed by the doorway and disappeared into the kitchen. I couldn't move. I just stood there, listening, breathing like I'd just run a mile. Then I heard a whisper, right in my ear. "You shouldn't be here." I screamed and ran for the front door. It wouldn't open. The lock was stuck. I fumbled with it for a full minute before it finally gave way. I ran outside barefoot into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the house across the street. An elderly woman answered the door. I must have looked wild, shaking, barefoot, babbling about shadows and voices. She let me in without question, gave me a blanket, and called the police. Again, the police searched my house. Again, nothing. No forced entry, no one inside, no sign of anyone hiding. But I knew. I knew something was in that house, something that didn't want me there. I didn't go back. I stayed in a motel for a week while I made arrangements to break my lease. It wasn't easy. The landlord gave me a hard time, threatened legal action, but eventually he let me out. I never got a straight answer from him about the house's history. But I started looking things up myself. I went to the local library and found a few old newspapers from 20 years back. There it was. A man had died in that house. His name was Gerald Bowen. He lived alone, no family, no visitors. The article said neighbors noticed a smell and called the police. They found him dead in the hallway, collapsed halfway between his bedroom and the kitchen. He'd been dead for 2 weeks before anyone noticed. The official cause was heart failure. Nothing suspicious. But I couldn't stop thinking about the knocking, the footsteps, the breathing. I talked to a retired neighbor named Harold. He told me no one had lived in that house for more than a few months since Gerald died. One woman moved out after only 2 weeks. Another family left in the middle of the night. No explanations. The landlord kept fixing it up, repainting, replacing the carpet, but the place always ended up vacant again. It's been nearly a year since I left. I don't tell many people what happened. Most wouldn't believe me. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, when everything is quiet, I still hear those 3 knocks in my head. I haven't lived alone since. Story the end. It started on a Thursday night when the power went out in my apartment. I lived alone in a 1-bedroom place on the 2nd floor of a converted Victorian house in upstate New York. The kind of place that creaked even when no one moved, where the walls held whispers and the wood held memories. The storm had been raging since late afternoon, thunder rolling in like distant artillery fire and lightning cutting across the sky with surgical precision. By 8:47 p.m., everything went black. No TV, no internet, and worst of all, no lights. I wasn't new to being alone in bad weather. But this time there was something different about the air, heavy, like it carried a warning. I lit 3 candles and set them in the living room. Their flickering made the shadows in the corners seem like they were moving, but I chalked it up to wind and nerves. I made some tea on the gas stove and tried to distract myself with a book, but I kept losing track of what I was reading. My eyes kept drifting to the hallway that led to the bedroom and bathroom. It was darker there, the candlelight unable to stretch that far. Around 10:15 p.m., I heard it. A creak on the floorboards. Not from the storm, and not from the house settling. It was the deliberate kind of creak, like someone shifting their weight from one foot to another. I froze, my mug halfway to my lips. My first instinct was to call out, but I didn't. Instead, I listened. The noise didn't come again. I set the mug down, stood up quietly, and tiptoed over to the hallway. I held my breath and leaned my head just enough to see around the corner. Darkness. Pure black. I told myself it was just the wind or maybe the building expanding from the change in temperature. Still, I grabbed the small flashlight from the kitchen drawer and turned it on. The beam wasn't strong, but it was enough to scan the hall. Nothing. I checked the bedroom. Empty. Then the bathroom. Nothing again. I laughed to myself a little, an uneasy, forced sound, and went back to the living room. But just as I sat down, I heard something else. A whisper. It was faint, like it was coming through water. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely a voice. A woman's voice, low and shaky. It came from the same hallway I had just checked. I stood up again, flashlight in hand, and this time I said something. "Hello?" The whisper stopped. "Is someone there?" Nothing. I walked back toward the hallway slowly. My own footsteps sounded too loud. I scanned with the flashlight again, the beam bouncing off the walls and catching small glints in the mirror at the end of the hall. Then something moved. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light. It was the bathroom door. I had left it open when I checked earlier, but now it was almost shut, just slightly ajar. I stepped closer, the floor cold under my feet. I pushed the door slowly, the hinges groaning, and the flashlight revealed nothing. The room was empty. But as I stepped in to take a better look, the door slammed shut behind me. I screamed and spun around, yanking the door open again. No one was there. My heart was hammering, and for a moment I thought I might pass out. I backed out of the bathroom and sat down on the hallway floor, trying to catch my breath. That's when I heard the whisper again, right next to my ear. "Help me." I dropped the flashlight. It clattered to the floor, the beam spinning wildly until it landed pointing at the far wall. I didn't even look. I just ran. I bolted back to the living room and grabbed my phone, but there was no signal. No Wi-Fi, and apparently no cellular connection either. I wanted to leave the apartment, but the storm was still pounding outside, and the idea of stepping into the dark hallway of the building was worse than staying put. I locked the front door and backed away, curling up on the couch with the flashlight shaking in my hand. The whispering didn't stop. It kept coming, now louder. Sometimes close to my ear, other times across the room. I heard my name once, and that's when I lost it. I covered my ears, but the voices seemed to bleed through. My mind kept playing tricks. Seeing movement in the shadows, hearing footsteps in the kitchen, watching the candles flicker like someone was walking past them. By 1 a.m., I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and shoes and decided I'd rather risk the storm than whatever was happening inside that place. I opened the door and stopped cold. At the end of the building's hallway stood a woman. Pale, soaked like she'd been standing in the rain for hours. Her dress clung to her thin frame, and her hair hung in strings around her face. She didn't move, just stared at me. I took a step back. Who are you?" She tilted her head, and then I saw it. Her eyes were black. No whites, no iris, just empty voids. And worse, her mouth was slightly open like she was breathing heavily, but there was no sound. I slammed the door and locked it again. For the next hour, I didn't move. I kept the flashlight on the door, expecting her to bang on it, to scream, to try to force her way in. But she never did. The only sound was the storm outside, now beginning to calm. By 3:30 a.m., the power returned with a loud click. The overhead lights blinked on, the refrigerator hummed to life, and my TV flashed the blue screen of standby mode. The apartment looked normal again. I didn't sleep. The next day, I called the landlord and told him something weird had happened. I didn't mention the ghost, or whatever it was, but I asked if anyone else had experienced strange things. He hesitated before saying something I'll never forget. "You're not the first person to ask that. Apartment 2B used to belong to a woman named Grace. She disappeared during a storm. Police never found her body. That was about 6 years ago. I lived in apartment 2B. I moved out a week later. But even now, sometimes when the power goes out, I hear a whisper in the dark saying my name, and I never respond." Story the end. It started with the electricity cutting out. I was used to power outages now and then, especially in that small rural town where storms frequently knocked out lines or squirrels chewed through something they shouldn't have. I didn't panic. I lit a few candles, turned off my laptop to save the battery, and figured I'd get an early night's rest. But as the house settled around me and the world outside faded into stillness, I realized something about this night was different. The house I lived in was an old rental, perched on a long stretch of road flanked by overgrown woods. My nearest neighbor was half a mile down, and at night the absence of light turned the entire area into a black void. Even when the power was on, my phone reception was patchy at best. So when the lights died and the signal dropped with them, I was effectively cut off. I had lived alone for 6 months. It had taken a while to get used to the creaks and groans of an aging house settling into its foundation each night. But on this particular night, around 11:30 p.m., I heard something that didn't sound like the house. It was a soft tapping, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from the back of the house near the laundry room. I stayed in bed, frozen for a moment, unsure if I had imagined it. When it continued, 3 taps, a pause, then 3 more, I got up and quietly moved through the hallway. My flashlight was dim, the batteries nearly dead. I cursed myself for not replacing them earlier. I crept to the back of the house and stood still in the kitchen, listening. Tap, tap, tap. It was unmistakable now, coming from the outside wall near the back door. Not a tree branch brushing against the siding, not an animal scurrying across the roof. It was the sound of knuckles knocking, like someone was standing out there in the dark and patiently rapping on the wood. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a raccoon, maybe wind knocking something loose. I stood at the window next to the door and peeked out through the curtain, but the outside was pitch black. Not even the moon was out. The knocking stopped. Just as I started to breathe a little easier, there was a new sound. A creaking floorboard. Inside the house. I turned my head toward the living room, heart thudding. I hadn't stepped on anything to make that noise. I wasn't near any floorboards that creaked. That sound had come from further in, near the front entrance. Slowly, I walked forward. The air felt heavier with each step, like something unseen was pressing down on me. I reached the living room and swung my dim flashlight around. Everything looked in place. The couch, the coffee table, the old armchair by the window. But there was something wrong. I felt watched. Like someone was holding their breath just out of my vision. I stood in the middle of the room for a full minute, then 2. Silence. Then something moved. Not a loud noise, not a crash, just a shadow shifting on the far wall like someone had walked past the front window. But that couldn't be. There was no light source outside to cast a shadow. My pulse quickened. I rushed to the window and pulled back the curtain. Again, nothing, just darkness. I squinted harder, my eyes adjusted, and then, barely visible, I saw what looked like a smudge on the glass. 5 streaks, as if someone had placed their hand there and slowly dragged it downward. I backed away from the window. My bedroom felt like the only safe place now. I bolted back toward it, locked the door behind me, and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't want to call the cops. I didn't even know what to say if I did. Hi, I think someone's standing outside my house knocking, but now they might be inside too. I clutched my phone anyway. 1 bar of signal flickered in and out. I tried sending a message to my brother. It didn't go through. I was alone. Something slid across the floor outside my bedroom door. Not heavy, not sharp, just the sound of something small being dragged. I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Breathing, not mine. Deeper. Raspy. Just beyond the door. I stepped back, barely able to breathe myself. The candle on my nightstand flickered wildly for no reason. I hadn't moved. There wasn't a breeze. The flame stretched sideways like it was reacting to something, someone standing near it. And then it blew out. Total darkness. I fumbled with my phone flashlight. It lit up barely enough for me to see the outlines of the furniture, the door, the mirror across the room. My reflection stared back, pale and wide-eyed. But as I held the light toward it, I saw something else in the mirror. Someone standing behind me. I spun around. Nothing. I turned back to the mirror. No one there now. Now, just me. I had to get out. I unlocked the door and cracked it open slowly. The hallway was darker than it should have been. The flashlight flickered in and out like it was short-circuiting. I moved cautiously, each step a gamble. I made it to the kitchen again, opened the back door, and stared out into the night. The woods loomed silent, dense. A part of me told me to run, but I knew running into the woods in the middle of the night would be stupid. I opted for the front door instead. I swung it open and froze. On my porch, there was a figure. A tall shape, shrouded in what looked like old wet fabric. It didn't move. It didn't speak. It just stood there, head tilted slightly to one side like it was studying me. I tried to scream, but my throat locked up. I slammed the door shut and threw the bolt. A second later, a sharp bang rattled the door. Then another, like fists pounding it with inhuman strength. I backed away, and it stopped just as suddenly. And then all the lights in the house came back on. Everything was silent again. The heater clicked on. The fridge buzzed softly in the background. My phone signal returned. 3 missed messages from my brother appeared. I hesitated, then slowly opened the front door again. The porch was empty. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with every light on, clutching a kitchen knife. When the sun rose, I packed a bag and left. I never returned to that house. A week later, the landlord called me. He was confused about why I'd left all of a sudden. I didn't have the words to explain, but before we hung up, he said something that has haunted me since. You know, the guy who lived there before you, he broke his lease too. Left in the middle of the night. Said the house was breathing. Whatever that means. I said nothing. I just hung up. Story the end. It was supposed to be just another quiet night at the auto shop. I had pulled the late shift again, something I usually didn't mind. Fewer people around, no phones ringing, no distractions. Just me, my tools, and the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. The shop sat on the edge of town, just off a poorly lit road surrounded by trees and patches of forgotten industrial buildings. Not exactly scenic, but it paid the bills. My name's Derek. I've worked as a mechanic for 12 years and at Redline Auto for the last 4. I'm not the superstitious type. You have to be practical in this line of work. Either the car works or it doesn't. Either there's a leak or there isn't. There's no room for imagination in diagnostics. That's probably why what happened that night has stuck with me, because no matter how many times I try to reason it away, it doesn't make sense. And I've stopped trying. It started around 9:40 p.m. I remember checking the clock above the office door as I was finishing up an oil change on a late model Civic. The customer had dropped it off earlier, and I'd told them I'd have it ready by morning. No big deal. Big deal. Routine stuff. I was rolling myself out from under the car when I heard it. The sound of a wrench clattering onto the concrete floor in the next bay over. It wasn't a loud crash, more like a sudden clink of metal against cement. Now, I'm meticulous about my workspace. I knew I hadn't left any tools out over there. I got up slowly, wiped my hands on a rag, and walked to the adjacent bay. Nothing. No one. The air felt just a little too still. I glanced at the workbench, the floor. A 14mm socket was lying just near the tire of the pickup I'd worked on earlier in the day. It wasn't one I'd been using. I leaned down, picked it up, and instinctively looked around again. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I'd left it out without realizing it. Maybe it had been resting on a ledge and slipped off. I tossed it back into the tool chest and went back to the Civic. But that wasn't the end of it. 10 minutes later, I was in the back corner of the shop, near the parts shelves, looking for a new oil filter when the overhead shop radio, the one that plays the local rock station 24/7, suddenly cut out mid-song. Not a power outage, just silence. Then static. Then something else, like a whisper under the fuzz. I stepped toward it, squinting at the old stereo mounted on the wall, and that's when I swore I heard it, someone whispering my name. Derek. Derek. Too soft to be a coincidence. I froze, staring at the speakers as if something might emerge from them. A second passed, then the static disappeared and the song resumed like nothing had happened. I reached up and turned the radio off. I told myself it was interference, maybe some random broadcast, maybe a fluke. Still, my hands were cold. I got back to work. I tried not to look at the shadows that seemed deeper than usual in the corners of the shop. I tried to ignore the feeling that someone was standing just behind me every time I leaned into the engine bay, but it kept building, the sense of being watched. At around 10:15, I walked out front to lock the main bay door. It was already down, but I like to double-check at night. As I approached, I saw it was still halfway open. I hadn't left it that way. I remembered distinctly hitting the control button earlier when the temperature started to drop. I walked over and jabbed the button again. It screeched as it rolled shut. I waited until it thudded closed, then twisted the latch. That's when I saw it. A reflection. The glass of the office window behind me showed something, or someone, standing near the entrance to the parts room. It was just a dark silhouette, but unmistakably human-shaped. My stomach dropped. I turned around instantly. Nothing. I stormed back through the bays, flipping on all the lights as I went, calling out, "Hello? Who's there?" My voice echoed off the metal walls, thin and flat. No answer. I checked every room. The parts shelves, the small restroom, even the employee break room in the back with the flickering microwave. Nothing. And yet that feeling lingered. Around 10:40, I was trying to finish up the Civic. I just needed to reset the oil light and take a few notes on the inspection sheet. My hands were trembling a little. I kept thinking I heard footsteps behind me, light and deliberate. Not the loud stomp of boots, but something careful. I turned around at least 4 times in 5 minutes. Nothing. Still, I didn't want to panic. I'd had a long week, hadn't slept great, maybe I was just on edge. Then the lights went out. Not all at once. Not a power failure, just the overhead fluorescent lights in the bay I was working in. They flickered once, twice, then died. The ones in the adjacent bay stayed on. The ones in the office, too. Just mine. I stood there, holding the clipboard, staring up. Then, from the dark, I heard a breath. It was right next to me. I swear I felt it on the side of my neck, warm and slow, like someone exhaling deliberately to be felt. I jumped back so fast I knocked over the oil catch tray. It spilled across the concrete in a thick black smear. I grabbed the flashlight from my tool cart and swept it around the bay. Shadows danced wildly. There was nothing there. But I knew I wasn't alone. I sprinted into the office and locked the door. I don't know why. It's not like it would keep anything out if it really wanted in. But it felt safer. The overhead light buzzed quietly. The desk clock read 11:07. My hands were shaking. I sat down behind the counter and stared at the CCTV monitor that showed the 4 security cameras positioned in the shop. Most of the time, I don't even pay attention to them, but this time I watched. Camera 1 showed the front lot, empty. Camera 2 showed the main work bays, still. Camera 3 was the parts aisle, quiet. Then camera 4, inside the office. My heart jumped into my throat. There was someone standing behind me. I didn't move. I stared at the monitor, at the blurred, shadowy figure standing just behind my chair. No face, just a shape, and it wasn't moving. I sat frozen, afraid to even breathe. Slowly, I turned in my chair. No one. The room was empty. I looked back at the monitor, still there, same spot, but my eyes saw nothing behind me. I got up slowly, turning around in circles, shining my flashlight into every corner. I even opened the closet in the office. Empty. But on the monitor, it was still there. That was when I realized the temperature had dropped. The kind of drop that hurts your lungs when you breathe. I could see my breath in the office and the small window fogged from the inside. I backed away toward the door, heart racing. Then the monitor cut to static. All 4 cameras. Static. That was it for me. I grabbed my phone, my keys, and bolted. I didn't even turn the lights off. I just ran for my truck and peeled out of the lot like a bat out of hell. The next morning, I came back just after dawn, brought my manager with me, told him I thought someone might have broken in. I didn't say anything about the shadow or the breath on my neck or the figure in the camera. We checked the place top to bottom. Nothing was stolen. No signs of forced entry. Everything looked normal except the oil spill where I had knocked the tray. Even the cameras, they were all working fine. No corrupted files. Nothing to explain what I'd seen. But the weirdest part? On the monitor, the previous night's footage showed me working on the Civic, locking the front bay, even going into the office. But the camera in the office never showed the figure behind me. Not once. Just me, staring at the screen like a deer in headlights. I haven't taken a night shift since. I still work at Redline Auto, but only during daylight. I won't be alone in that building again. I can't. And some nights, even in my apartment, when it gets too quiet, I still feel it, like something just outside of view is watching, waiting, like it came home with me. And sometimes when the lights flicker or the air goes cold for no reason, I wonder if I really ever left it behind at all. Story the end. It was nearly midnight when the last tram rolled past the tiny corner shop where Saeed worked. The neon open sign flickered overhead, casting a low hum into the otherwise silent street. The city had gone to sleep, and even the buzzing noise of distant traffic had dissolved into the humid summer night. Saeed, 29, short, serious, and a bit withdrawn, had taken the night shift at the shop as a second job to help cover his sister's medical bills. It was supposed to be easy, boring even. Keep the shelves stocked, ring up the occasional late-night customer, mop the floor, then close up at 3 a.m. It wasn't a neighborhood known for crime, and it certainly wasn't one known for anything supernatural. At least, that's what he thought. The first time it happened, Saeed chalked it up to exhaustion. Around 1:17 a.m., as he checked inventory behind the cigarette counter, he heard a soft knock on the front glass door. When he looked up, nobody was there. Not unusual. Drunk people sometimes wandered past and knocked just for fun, but this knock was slow, methodical. He watched for a few more seconds, shrugged, and turned back to his clipboard. Then came the knock again, harder this time. Not playful, not testing, almost deliberate. He turned fast, fully expecting someone playing a prank. The shopfront windows were clean and wide, letting in a clear view of the deserted street. No footsteps, no car passing, not even a stray cat. Just the deep stillness of late night. He walked over and flipped the lock just in case. The knock didn't come again. The next night, it happened again, at the same time. 1:17 a.m. This time, he was in the back room, restocking snacks from a box. The knock echoed from the storefront, and despite the multiple rows of shelves and the humming coolers, it pierced the silence. 3 distinct knocks. 1, 2, 3. Like a rhythm. He felt his skin tighten. He waited, breathing slowly. When he finally worked up the nerve to peek out from the back room, the front of the store was empty. Silent. Again. That night, when he got home, he didn't sleep. Not because he was scared, he told himself that, but because his head was spinning with possibilities. What if someone was trying to rob the place? Maybe they were scoping it out. Maybe it was just kids. Or maybe something worse. On the third night, Saeed arrived 10 minutes early. He brought a small kitchen knife from home just to keep behind the counter. It was absurd. But something about that knock had planted itself in his mind like a splinter. He'd never believed in ghosts. He still didn't. Not really. But he also couldn't ignore the strange feeling that something wasn't right. The hours passed slowly. 10 p.m. A couple came in for cigarettes. 11:30 p.m. A cab driver grabbed some water and gum. Midnight. Nothing. Then the store was dead silent again. Time moved like syrup. Saeed found himself watching the clock. 1:10 a.m. His hands were damp with sweat, gripping the edge of the counter. The second hand ticked toward 1:17. At exactly the same moment as the previous 2 nights, the knock came. But this time, Saeed was watching the door when it happened, and no one was there. The knock echoed across the glass, clear, heavy, like someone pressing their knuckles hard against it. He stared in disbelief. He could see the empty sidewalk. The street lamp bathed the area in yellowish light. There were no shadows, no movement, but the knock had been unmistakable. 1, 2, 3. He stepped out from behind the counter, holding the knife low by his side, his breath caught in his throat. He unlocked the door and yanked it open. Nothing. Just the warm air of a city night. That was the first time he felt it. The sense that he wasn't alone, even though he was. The fourth night, he considered calling in sick, but he couldn't afford it. He told himself he would just ignore it. He would bring headphones, maybe play music. But the moment the store went quiet, he couldn't bring himself to put them on. He didn't want to drown out the silence. That night, the knock didn't come. Instead, the lights in aisle 4 began to flicker. Aisle 4 was the pet supplies and household items, litter boxes, detergent, light bulbs. There was no reason for the overhead lights to blink like that. They were LEDs, brand new. And it wasn't a power surge. The rest of the store was fine. He walked over slowly, frowning, then looked up at the ceiling fixture. It stopped flickering the moment he stood under it. Then came the sound of something falling behind him. A thud. He turned around and saw a bag of cat food lying in the middle of the aisle. It had been on the top shelf. He remembered putting it there himself earlier in the evening. He bent down, picked it up, and put it back. No big deal, he told himself. A shelf vibration, maybe. Loose packaging, nothing to worry about. But the moment he turned away, it fell again. This time he didn't touch it. He just backed away slowly and returned to the counter. He watched the aisle from behind the register, heart racing, not blinking. Nothing moved again. The rest of the night passed without incident, but he didn't sleep when he got home. By the 5th night, his nerves were frayed. His coworkers joked about how pale he looked. He didn't share what was happening. They'd think he was losing it. That night, everything was quiet until nearly 2 a.m. Then, all at once, every light in the store went out. Total blackness. The emergency lights above the entrance kicked in a few seconds later, dim red bulbs that barely illuminated the space. Saeed sat frozen behind the counter, his phone lighting up in his hand as he opened the flashlight app. The coolers had gone silent. The hum of the AC had stopped. The world was dead quiet. Then he heard it. Not a knock this time. Footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. On the linoleum floor from somewhere back in the aisles. He held his breath. The steps paused, then continued. A few more. Closer. He raised the flashlight and shone it toward the back of the store, just beyond aisle 4. Nothing. He called out, "Hello?" Silence. Then, as though it had heard him, the footsteps started again, but this time faster, rushing. toward him. He stood, backing away from the counter, panic clawing at his chest. Just as he reached for the front door, the power snapped back on with a loud click. Lights, coolers, AC, all whirred to life, and the store was empty. He quit that night. He didn't lock up, didn't even grab his bag. He walked out and didn't come back. But the story didn't end there. 3 days later, his manager called him, saying they'd reviewed the CCTV footage. Not to fire him, but because they were concerned. There was something on the tape. Saeed agreed to meet at the store during the day. Bright sun, customers, safety. The manager brought him to the small office in the back and loaded up the footage from the night the power went out. It showed Saeed sitting behind the counter, staring straight ahead. The lights cut out. He stood, turned on his phone light, then nothing. No footsteps could be heard on the recording. But the strange part was the cooler glass doors. In the footage, just before the power returned, the reflection in the cooler showed something moving. Something behind Saeed. Something pale, hunched, with long arms and no distinct features. It moved swiftly, more like a shadow than a body. Just as the lights flicked back on, it vanished. Saeed left without a word. For weeks, he didn't sleep properly. But he was done with the shop, done with night shifts. He found another job working day hours at a hardware store in a different neighborhood. He thought that was the end. But about a month later, while closing the new shop late one evening, he heard a knock on the front glass door. 123. He turned slowly. Nothing was there. Story the end. It was supposed to be a quiet night. Tanya worked as an assistant curator at the district's small history museum, a job she took more for her love of old buildings and dusty archives than anything else. She'd always liked being around things with stories, relics that whispered about the past if you paid enough attention. It wasn't a prestigious job, nor did it pay well, but she didn't mind. The building was peaceful. Nestled on the edge of town, the beat had a Victorian manor-turned museum with creaky wood floors, faded wallpaper, and a history that stretched back to the 1800s. On this particular night, she was covering for the night security guard who'd called in sick. It wasn't part of her usual duties, but the museum director, a sharp woman in her 60s named Marla, had called in a favor. "All you have to do is monitor the cameras and make a round or two," Marla had said over the phone. "You'll be fine. It's only one night." Tanya had hesitated, not because she was afraid, she wasn't, but because she valued her quiet evenings at home. Still, she owed Marla a favor, and besides, she had a backlog of digital archives to sort through. If nothing else, it would be a chance to catch up. She arrived just after 8 p.m. The sun had already dipped below the tree line, and the long shadows of the surrounding woods swallowed the property whole. The museum always looked more imposing at night. It wasn't just the size or the architecture. It was the stillness, like the house was holding its breath. Inside, the air was cooler than outside, and it smelled like old paper and polished wood. Tanya made her way to the back office, where the security monitors were set up. A wall of grainy black and white screens displayed various rooms: the Civil War exhibit, the restored dining room, the upstairs nursery with its antique dolls, the basement storage that always gave her a bad feeling. She flipped through the camera views, checking for anything out of place. All was quiet. She set her laptop on the desk, plugged in, and began sorting files. For the first hour or so, nothing happened. She sipped her tea, glanced at the monitors occasionally, and immersed herself in the catalog of digitized photographs. Around 10:30, the temperature dropped. Tanya noticed it first in her fingertips, cold despite the warm mug in her hand. Then her shoulders tensed and she realized she was shivering. The thermostat on the wall still read 71 degrees Fahrenheit. She rubbed her arms and got up, thinking maybe the vent had blown cold air directly on her. But as she moved through the office, she felt the chill in her legs too. It wasn't isolated. A sudden thump echoed through the hallway outside the office. Tanya froze. It sounded like something heavy dropping on the wooden floor. Not a crash, more like a deliberate thud. She glanced at the monitors. Nothing moved. No doors opening, no shadows. Still, she stepped out into the hallway, flashlight in hand. The museum lights were dimmed after hours, and only small spotlights highlighted the main exhibits. Her shoes tapped softly against the hardwood as she moved. She checked the first floor, the lobby, the Civil War room, the parlor. Nothing out of place. Then another came, this time above her. It was upstairs. Tanya hesitated at the foot of the grand staircase. She looked up into the darkened hallway above, where the children's room and the servant quarters were preserved. A logical voice in her head said it was just something falling. Maybe a display had come loose. Museums were full of unstable pieces and old wood, but that didn't explain the cold. She climbed the stairs slowly. The banister felt cold under her hand, colder than wood should feel. At the top, she clicked on her flashlight and swept the beam left and right. Nothing. The nursery door was slightly ajar. She distinctly remembered closing it during her earlier rounds. It always stuck slightly when you closed it with a click of the latch. She approached the door and gently pushed it open with 2 fingers. The flashlight beam illuminated the small room. Antique toys sat frozen on shelves, a child's rocking chair in the corner. 4 porcelain dolls sat on a lace-covered bench. Everything looked as it should, until one of the dolls moved. Not dramatically, just a slight tilt of the head as if nudged. But Tanya hadn't touched anything, and there was no breeze. She swallowed hard, backing slowly out of the room. She didn't turn around until she reached the stairs, feeling the weight of the house pressing on her back. Once downstairs, she hurried back to the office. The screen still showed no movement. She sat down and tried to focus. She didn't believe in ghosts. Not really. But she also couldn't explain what she saw. Then one of the monitors, camera 4, the upstairs hallway, flickered. She leaned in, the image cleared, and for a moment, nothing was there. Then someone stepped into frame. A woman. Barefoot, dressed in a long, old-fashioned nightgown. Her hair was dark and unkempt, hanging in tangles. Her head was tilted slightly, and she stared directly at the camera. Tanya's heart stopped. She grabbed her phone and dialed Marla. It rang 5 times, then voicemail. She didn't leave a message. Instead, she looked back at the monitor. The woman was gone. She rewound the footage. The woman was never there. The playback showed only in hallway. A sudden click came from behind her. The office door. She turned quickly. The door was swinging closed, slowly, silently. She hadn't left it open. It closed with a soft click, and the moment it did, the monitors all went black. No, she muttered, scrambling to check the wires. The power was on, her laptop still worked, but the camera feeds were dead. Then the overhead lights in the office flickered and died. Darkness. She stood slowly, flashlight trembling in her grip. The air had grown impossibly cold now, her breath faintly visible in the beam of the light. Then outside the office door she heard footsteps. Soft, slow, deliberate. They moved past the door, stopped, then came back, like pacing. She backed toward the far wall, bumping into the desk. The footsteps stopped, then a knock. 3 slow knocks on the office door. She didn't answer. The door creaked open an inch. She pointed the flashlight, but the beam flickered and dimmed. The batteries were fresh. She'd changed them just yesterday. From the sliver of the open door, she saw nothing, just blackness, and then a whisper. It came from right beside her ear, breath cold on her neck. Tanya. She screamed, spinning, but no one was there. The door swung open wider, not from wind, but like someone had pushed it with purpose. She bolted. Out of the office, down the hallway, past exhibits that loomed like shadowy figures. She didn't stop until she reached the front door. It was locked. Her keys were in the office. She turned back toward the hallway. It was darker now, like the shadows themselves were thicker. Footsteps again, but this time they were running, coming at her. She threw herself against the door, pounding, screaming for help. Her voice echoed off the walls, but no one came. Then silence. The footsteps stopped. The lights flickered back on. Behind her down the hall stood the woman in the nightgown. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, with a mouth that hung slightly open. Tanya stared. Frozen. The woman didn't move. She just stood, swaying slightly, eyes locked on Tanya's. Then she spoke. "Don't leave me alone." Tanya turned, kicked at the lock, screamed until her throat hurt. When she looked back, the woman was gone. Later, the police would find her curled in the foyer, half-conscious, babbling about whispers and shadows. The security footage would show nothing. No woman, no footsteps, not even the moment she'd screamed. Just her, alone, slowly panicking as if something unseen was stalking her. She never went back to the museum. The night guard returned the following evening and found nothing unusual. Except one thing. In the nursery, one of the porcelain dolls had been placed on the rocking chair. It faced the hallway, and someone had scratched into the wood of the chair. Don't leave me alone. Story, the end. The building was one of those long-forgotten municipal offices on the edge of the city, where the roads thinned out and the street lights buzzed more than they glowed. Um, I had taken a temporary job as a night security guard, just a 3-week stint while the regular guy was recovering from knee surgery. They said it was easy money. Sit at the front desk from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., check the cameras, walk the perimeter twice during the shift, and that was it. It seemed too good to be true. And in hindsight, it was. The first 2 nights were dull in the best way possible. The building had 3 floors, but I was told I only needed to monitor the first 2. The third was supposedly closed for renovations, though that always seemed strange to me. There were no tools, no paint buckets, not even a taped-off warning sign. Just a door with a deadbolt and a sign that read, "Authorized personnel only." The cameras were old and grainy, mounted in corners that didn't cover much. There were a few in the hallways, one in the parking lot, and one by the main entrance. The third floor had no surveillance. I brought a book to read, but I spent most of my time listening to the humming of the vending machines and checking my watch every 10 minutes. Time stretched in that place. It was the third night when something felt different. I got in at 9:50 as usual. The air felt heavier, like a storm was hanging just above the building, but there were no clouds when I looked outside, just a wide open sky. Around 1:30 a.m., I started hearing the first noises, faint footsteps on the floor above me. I paused the security feed I was skimming through and listened. They weren't quick or panicked, just slow, measured steps, one, then another. Then silence. I sat still for a moment, convinced it was just the building settling. But then the steps came again, more insistent this time. I picked up the radio and tried to reach maintenance, but there was no answer. Not that they'd be working at that hour anyway. I hesitated for longer than I'd like to admit before I stood up and grabbed the flashlight. The stairwell to the third floor was always dark. The motion-activated lights rarely worked up there. I opened the stairwell door slowly, and sure enough, the top landing was pitch black. My flashlight flickered as I stepped onto the stairs. I reached the third floor door and checked the lock. Still bolted. The sign was hanging slightly crooked, but otherwise everything looked the same. I was just about to turn back when I heard something behind the door. Not footsteps this time. Breathing. Shallow, shaky breaths. I pressed my ear against the door, and the breathing stopped instantly. I took a few steps back, heart hammering against my ribs, and returned to the first floor. The rest of the night was uneventful, but I couldn't stop thinking about the breathing. I convinced myself it had to be in my head. A trick of the acoustics. The wind, maybe. Anything. The following night, I brought headphones and tried to drown out the silence. It worked for a while. But just after 2 a.m., I got an alert from the front door camera. Someone was standing just outside the entrance, motionless. The feed was too grainy to make out any details, but I could tell it was a woman. She was wearing something long, maybe a gown or a dress, and she wasn't moving. I leaned closer. No knocking. No attempt to come in. Just standing. Her face was turned downward like she was looking at her own feet. I switched to the parking lot camera to see if she had arrived in a car. Nothing. I got up and walked to the glass door. She was gone. Just vanished. No trace of her on the pavement, not even a footprint in the thin layer of dust near the stairs. I replayed the footage. The timestamp read 2:03 a.m. She appeared in one frame, and in the very next. Gone. I didn't report it. What would I say? A woman in a nightgown teleported off the front steps? That night, I barely blinked. I kept every light in the office on. Around 4 a.m., I thought I heard whispering from the hallway, but it stopped the moment I stood up. I didn't check. I couldn't. I just waited out the remaining hours, jumping at every creak, every groan of the HVAC system. On the 5th night, something new happened. I was doing my routine perimeter walk when I passed the stairwell again. This time, the third floor door was ajar. Not wide open, just cracked enough for the fluorescent light inside to spill out onto the stairs. That door should have been locked. I stepped up and pushed the door open with the tip of my flashlight. The hallway was lined with old office doors, each one labeled with outdated department names. Records, payroll, internal affairs. The walls were stained with water damage and the carpet felt soggy under my boots. I should have turned back, but something compelled me to walk further in. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something else. I passed a broken clock stuck at 3:11. Every door I passed was closed, except one near the end of the hall. It had no label, no doorknob, just a faint glow coming from underneath. I approached slowly. The closer I got, the colder the air felt. My breath started fogging up in front of me. I reached for the door, but before I could touch it, it creaked open on its own. Inside was a small office with a single chair facing the wall. On the wall was a cracked mirror, and in the mirror was the woman from the camera. Her reflection stared at me, even though there was nothing in the chair. She was wearing the same long gown, hair matted and wet, eyes sunken like she hadn't slept in decades. I stepped backward, tripping over the threshold. My flashlight rolled out of my hand and clattered down the hallway, flickering. I scrambled up and ran, not even bothering to grab the flashlight. When I got to the stairwell, the door slammed shut behind me, hard enough to rattle the bolts. The rest of the shift I spent locked in the front office. I unplugged the monitor feed. I couldn't watch anymore. The next night, I called in sick. Then I called the temp agency and quit altogether. I didn't want my final paycheck. I didn't care about the reference. I just wanted to forget that place. Weeks later, I ran into the regular security guard at a corner store. He recognized me and laughed. "You lasted longer than the last guy," he said. I asked him if he'd ever seen anything strange in that building. He went quiet for a moment, then said, "Third floor, right?" I nodded. He leaned in and whispered, "That floor's not supposed to be used, ever. Years ago, before they closed it, a woman who worked in records stayed late. No one knows why, but the janitor found her the next morning, sitting in a chair, staring at the wall. She was dead. No signs of trauma, just dead. And the mirror above her cracked straight down the middle." He grabbed his pack of cigarettes and paid for his things, then paused before leaving. "Whatever you saw, don't think too hard about it. That building, it doesn't like being remembered." I never went back. I still sometimes dream of that cracked mirror and the reflection of the woman who wasn't really there. I always wake up at 3:11 a.m. Story the end. The night had fallen heavily over the city. Streetlights flickered intermittently, casting uneven shadows across the empty sidewalks. It was the kind of night when even the usual hum of traffic seemed muted, swallowed by an eerie stillness. Jason sat alone at his desk, the only light in his small apartment coming from the dim glow of his laptop screen. The deadline for his project was looming, and the silence was both a blessing and a curse. It was quiet enough to focus, yet the isolation was beginning to gnaw at him. Jason worked as a freelance graphic designer, often pulling late-night shifts to meet client demands. Tonight, however, the unease wasn't from exhaustion or stress. It was something else. An intangible pressure that he couldn't shake off. His apartment was on the 5th floor of an old building, one of those pre-war brick constructions with creaky floors and drafty windows. Most tenants were long-term residents who kept to themselves. Jason had only moved in a few weeks ago, eager for a place closer to downtown. The rent was cheap, but the atmosphere was heavy. Around midnight, Jason stretched and rubbed his eyes. He glanced toward the hallway outside his door. The building's main corridor was poorly lit, the bulbs buzzing faintly. Usually he could hear the occasional footsteps or muffled voices from neighbors coming home late, but tonight it was dead silent. The absence of sound made him uneasy. He shook his head and returned to his work, determined to finish the last few designs. But then he thought he heard something, a faint scraping noise coming from the hallway, like nails on the wooden floorboards. Jason paused, fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound stopped, replaced by a soft sigh that seemed to float through the cracked doorframe. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe the wind was slipping through the broken window panes somewhere down the hall, causing the old floor to creak. Yet the sound had been deliberate, slow, and methodical. His heart began to quicken, and he closed the laptop with a snap. Trying to calm himself, Jason stood and walked to the door, pressing his ear against it. The hallway was still empty. No lights flickered outside his apartment, but a cold draft brushed under the door. He pulled it open slightly and peeked out. The hallway was completely deserted, silent except for the low hum of the building's aged ventilation system. Jason's breath formed small clouds in the chilly air. He took a deep breath and stepped outside, closing the door behind him. The silence felt oppressive now, as if the darkness had weight. His footsteps echoed unnaturally down the narrow corridor. He reached the stairwell and glanced down. The dim light barely illuminated the stairs, but he noticed something at the bottom landing, a shadow that didn't quite fit. It was fleeting, gone before he could focus. Jason rubbed his eyes again. Maybe he was just tired. He returned to his apartment, locking the door behind him with more force than necessary. The scrape came again, softer this time, as if dragging across the floor. It sounded like it was coming from the apartment directly below his. Number 4B. He didn't know the tenant there, but the door was always locked tight. Jason sat back down, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He opened the window a crack to let in some fresh air, but the chill only deepened his discomfort. That's when he saw it. A pale face pressed against the window from the building across the street. The eyes were dark, hollow, staring straight at him. He blinked, and the face vanished. His heart pounded. He wanted to convince himself it was a trick of the shadows or a passerby outside playing a prank. He leaned back, trying to steady his breath. Then the lights flickered and went out. Jason sat in pitch darkness, save for the glow of his laptop screen, which had gone black with the power outage. The silence was broken by the slow creaking of the floorboards outside his door, a deliberate, measured creak, like footsteps pacing. He reached for his phone but realized he'd left it charging in the living room. As he moved to get it, a cold presence brushed past him, like a whisper of ice against his skin. Goosebumps erupted over his arms. He called out, voice shaking, "Hello?" No response, just the sound of slow footsteps stopping right outside his door. Suddenly, the door handle rattled. Jason froze, eyes wide in the dark. The handle turned slowly, but the door didn't open. A whisper floated through the crack beneath the door, unintelligible but urgent, desperate. Jason's breath hitched. He backed away slowly, heart racing. The footsteps retreated, leaving an unbearable silence. The power flickered back on. The apartment was empty. Trying to calm down, Jason sat back at his desk. His laptop powered up automatically, but on the screen was a single file he hadn't opened before. He clicked it hesitantly. It was a video file, recorded from a shaky camera angle. The timestamp was from earlier that same day, around mid-afternoon. Jason watched as the video showed a view of his own apartment building's hallway. The camera was shaky, but he recognized the peeling paint and dim bulbs. Suddenly, a figure appeared, a pale woman with dark, sunken eyes, dressed in an old-fashioned white gown. She looked directly into the camera, mouth opening in a silent scream. The video ended abruptly. Jason felt a chill crawl down his spine. He clicked away, but the video had vanished from the folder. The phone buzzed on the desk. He jumped and reached for it. A text from an unknown number read, "You shouldn't be here tonight." His hands trembled. He typed back, "Who is this?" No reply. He tried calling the number, but it was disconnected. He looked around his apartment, now feeling completely exposed. The shadows seemed to stretch toward him, twisting and pulsing. His eyes caught movement at the edge of the room, something reflected in the mirror across the hallway. Jason got up and approached slowly. The mirror's surface rippled like water. For a fleeting moment, he saw her face again. The pale woman, eyes hollow, mouth stretched wide in silent terror. He stumbled backward, heart pounding like a drum in his chest. Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped drastically. His breath came out in frosty clouds. The woman appeared at the far end of the room, standing motionless. Jason's instincts screamed to run, but his legs felt rooted. The woman raised a translucent hand and pointed directly at him. Her mouth moved, forming words he couldn't hear. Then, without warning, she vanished. The power flickered again, and Jason was alone. He sat down heavily, gasping for air. His phone buzzed again. This time a message appeared on the lock screen. "Leave before it's too late." Jason grabbed his coat and keys. He bolted for the door, but as he reached it, it slammed shut on its own. He yanked at the handle. It wouldn't budge. Behind him, footsteps approached rapidly. Jason spun around, heart in his throat. The hallway was empty, but a cold whisper surrounded him, filling his ears. "You can't leave." He pounded on the door with all his strength. Then silence. Finally, the door unlocked. Jason didn't hesitate. He rushed down the stairs, two at a time, and out into the cold night air. Outside, the city seemed oddly distant, muffled. Jason didn't stop running until he reached a 24-hour cafe. He pushed inside, breathless, trying to explain what happened, but no one believed him. The staff exchanged worried glances and told him the building had been abandoned for years before he moved in. Confused and terrified, Jason checked his phone for a message from his landlord, only to find none. The next day, he went to the building to retrieve his belongings, accompanied by a friend. They entered 5B cautiously. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. Old newspapers dated back decades lay scattered on the floor. The apartment was exactly as he had left it, except for one chilling detail. A faded photograph lay on the floor near the window, showing a young woman in a white dress, smiling gently. On the back, a note in elegant handwriting, Emily, 1923. Jason's stomach turned cold. The woman in the video, the one haunting his nights, it was her. From then on, Jason never stayed alone at night in that building again. The sense of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the veil, never left him. He changed apartments, but the memory lingered, a shadow that crept into his dreams, reminding him that some places are better left empty after dark. Story the end. The night was unnervingly quiet when I found myself alone in the house. The kind of silence that presses in on you and makes every small sound feel amplified. It was late, around midnight, when the power suddenly flickered and went out, plunging everything into darkness. I had been working late, buried in paperwork at my desk, the dim glow of my laptop the only source of light, but now even that was gone. The house was older, creaky in all the right places, and had a reputation in the neighborhood for odd happenings, though I had never believed in any of it, until now. I reached for my phone, the only other thing with a battery that might help, but it was dead too. Strange, since I'd charged it just a couple of hours before. The room felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, making you shiver involuntarily. I stood up and felt my way toward the hallway, fumbling for the light switch. Nothing. I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, almost like a breath, coming from the living room. I told myself it was just the wind, or the old pipes groaning, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. The air felt heavier, thicker, and suddenly the house didn't feel so empty anymore. Slowly, I made my way to the living room, my hands brushing against the wall for guidance. The whispering sound grew a little louder, though still unintelligible, as if multiple voices were trying to speak, but none could form words. I stopped near the window and peered out into the blackness. The streetlight across the road flickered once and died, leaving me in almost complete darkness. I was about to turn away when something caught my eye, a shadow standing motionless on the other side of the window, just beyond the glass. I froze, my breath hitching. The figure was tall, indistinct, but unmistakably there. I blinked, and it was gone. My heart hammered in my chest. I knew I wasn't imagining things because I wasn't alone anymore. The whispering intensified, swirling around me, seeming to come from all directions. It was chilling and impossible to ignore. I wanted to call someone, but without a working phone, I was trapped. I decided to leave the house, but as I moved toward the door, it slammed shut by itself with a deafening bang. The sound echoed through the empty house like a gunshot, making me jump. I tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge, as if held shut by an invisible force. Panic crept in, and I ran back into the living room, looking for another exit. The windows were all locked, and I was in complete darkness. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it again. The figure had reappeared near the staircase. It was clearer now, a pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes staring at me. The whispering turned into a low moan that filled the room, vibrating in my chest. I backed away slowly, tripping over something on the floor. An old photograph I hadn't seen before. I picked it up with trembling hands. The photo was of the house, but years ago. In the picture, a family stood outside, smiling, but something was off. In the back, barely noticeable, was the same pale figure staring directly at the camera. My skin crawled. I dropped the photo and scrambled away. The moaning grew louder, closer. I could feel breath on my neck, icy cold and rasping. I ran upstairs, heart pounding like a drum, desperate to find a safe place. At the top of the stairs, the hallway was pitch black, but I could hear the whispering chasing me, like a predator closing in. I slammed the bedroom door shut behind me and locked it, the old lock rattling in protest. I collapsed against the door, gasping for breath. The whispering outside the room stopped abruptly, replaced by complete silence. Then, just as I thought I might finally have a moment's peace, I heard scratching on the other side of the door, slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across wood. My mind raced. What did it want? Why was it here? I tried to steady my shaking hands and reach for my phone, hoping maybe it had a little charge left. It didn't. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then stopped. Silence again. I sat there, frozen, waiting for something, anything to happen. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time lost meaning. Then a soft knock, 3 knocks, slow and measured. I answered, my voice barely above a whisper, "Who's there?" No response. I mustered my courage and cracked the door open just a little. The hallway was empty. I leaned out and saw nothing but darkness. No sign of the figure. The whispering was gone. The house was still. I stepped out, half expecting the entity to jump out from the shadows, but it didn't. I felt a cold breeze pass through the hall and the faint scent of old flowers, like lilacs, a smell I hadn't noticed before. I crept back downstairs and sat by the front window, watching the first hints of dawn lighten the sky. The house was silent again, peaceful even, but I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, I found the old photograph lying on the floor near the staircase, even though I was sure I had left it upstairs. I picked it up, looking closely this time. In the background, behind the family, the pale figure was no longer looking at the camera. Instead, it was looking directly at me. Story the end. It started on a night like many others, quiet, uneventful, and alone. I had just moved into a small, rented apartment on the edge of town. The building was old, nothing fancy, but affordable, and it suited my needs at the time. I was used to being alone. In fact, I preferred it. I had been through a difficult breakup and needed some time away from the noise of friends and family. The apartment was on the 3rd floor with windows that overlooked a small park and the dark outline of a dense tree line beyond. The first few nights were peaceful. I'd come home from work, cook something simple, and settle down with a book or a movie. But on the 3rd night, something changed. I remember sitting on the couch scrolling through my phone when suddenly the room temperature dropped. It wasn't a slight chill. It was sudden and biting, like someone had opened a freezer door right in front of me. I looked around, confused, and checked the thermostat. It read 70 degrees. No reason for the drop. A cold dread settled in my chest. I shrugged it off as my imagination and stood up to grab a blanket. As I turned, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, a shadow that seemed to detach itself from the wall and drift toward the hallway. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The hallway was dark, but this shadow moved, gliding without sound or disturbance. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was stress, moving to a new place, alone, adjusting to everything. I tried to shake off the feeling and went to bed early, but as the night deepened, I was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the floor below my bedroom. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth. I live alone. No pets, no roommates. It was impossible. I lay there, heart pounding, ears straining. The footsteps stopped. Silence swallowed the room. Then a whisper, barely audible, like someone breathing my name. I sat upright and called out, "Hello," no response. Just silence. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, listening. The air felt heavy, as if pressing in on me. When dawn finally broke, I convinced myself it was a bad dream, fueled by loneliness and anxiety. The next day, I went about my routine, but found myself checking the locks and windows obsessively. That evening, as I prepared dinner, the kitchen lights flickered repeatedly. I grabbed the breaker panel and reset the switches. The lights steadied, but the flickering seemed to have left a shadow behind, a shadow of unease. That night, I was on edge. I left the hallway light on and kept my phone close. Around midnight, the footsteps returned. Slow, heavy, pacing outside my bedroom door, my breath hitched. I mustered the courage to open the door and look into the hallway. Empty. But the cold was there, stronger now, pooling at my feet like a dark liquid. Suddenly, the closet door across the hall creaked open, just a crack. I stared, heart hammering, and heard a soft tap, 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 like knuckles rapping against the wood. I forced myself to approach. My hand trembling, I reached for the handle and flung the door open. Nothing. Just clothes hanging silently. Then I saw it. A face, pale and translucent, staring at me from the corner of the closet. Eyes sunken, dark, hollow, filled with sorrow and rage. I screamed and stumbled backward, slamming the door shut. My body shook uncontrollably. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I trusted, an old friend who had experience with these kinds of things. He told me it sounded like a residual haunting, a spirit tied to the place, replaying its last moments. He recommended I find out who had lived there before me. The next day, I visited the local library and searched old records. The apartment building was built in the 1920s. One name kept coming up, a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in my unit in the 1940s. According to the records, she had died mysteriously, found dead in her apartment, no apparent cause. The more I learned, the more I felt like I was living inside her story. That night, the spirit became more active. Objects moved on their own, whispers became voices, and the temperature dropped to freezing. I was trapped in a nightmare that I couldn't escape. One night, as I sat frozen on the couch, the apparition appeared fully. She was a young woman in a faded dress, her eyes empty but filled with sorrow. She mouthed words I couldn't hear. I asked aloud, "What do you want?" She pointed toward the bedroom window. I hesitated, then slowly walked over. Outside, the moonlight illuminated the yard below. I saw something glinting near the tree line. I went outside the next day and found an old locket buried in the dirt. Inside was a faded photo of a young woman, Eleanor. After that, the activity lessened. The cold presence faded, the footsteps stopped, and the whispers became distant memories. I never felt alone again. Story the end. The night I ended up alone in that old, creaking house was one I'll never forget. Not because anything spectacularly terrifying happened, but because of how unnervingly real everything felt. It was the kind of quiet that wasn't just the absence of sound, but a presence itself. Like the house was breathing, watching, waiting. I was a journalist at the time, working for a small local paper, and part of my beat was covering abandoned buildings slated for demolition or restoration. There was an old boarding house on the outskirts of town, the kind of place with peeling paint, shattered windows, and a sagging porch. The owners had gone bankrupt, and the house was empty now, slowly rotting away. But the stories about it ran deep. Neighbors said it was haunted. There were rumors about a woman who had lived there in the 1930s, a Mrs. Langston, who lost her husband and child in a tragic accident. After that, she was never quite the same. People said they heard her crying at night, saw her silhouette in the windows, even smelled perfume that didn't belong. I was skeptical. Ghost stories were great for paper sales, but I needed to see the house for myself. The owner gave me permission to spend one night inside, just to gather material for a feature story. It was more of a curiosity for me than anything else. I arrived late in the afternoon, a backpack full of gear, camera, voice recorder, flashlight, notebook. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the cracked sidewalk leading to the front steps. The front door was heavy and groaned as I pushed it open. Dust swirled in the air like lazy ghosts of their own. Inside, the house smelled like old wood and forgotten memories. Wallpaper curled from the walls and the floorboards creaked with every step. I set up in what used to be the parlor, a room with a fireplace and tall windows covered in grime. I planned to spend the night there, recording ambient sounds and jotting down impressions. As darkness fell, I lit a few candles and turned off my flashlight. The house settled around me. A low groan here, a distant pop there. Old houses always did that. I told myself it was nothing. But then, sometime after midnight, I started hearing it. At first, it was soft, like a whisper drifting from the hallway beyond the parlor. I strained to listen, but couldn't make out the words. The sound was fleeting, almost like the wind, except the windows were shut tight. I reached for my voice recorder, switching it on. I left it running, hoping to catch something unusual. Minutes later, a cold breeze swept through the room, despite the sealed windows. My candle flickered violently, then went out, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, fingers trembling. When I clicked it on, the beam landed on the far doorway. For a heartbeat, I thought I saw movement, a pale figure standing just beyond the threshold. I blinked. Nothing. Trying to steady my nerves, I stood and decided to explore. I followed the hallway toward the back of the house, the floor creaking beneath me. The air grew colder with every step. At the end of the hall was a door, cracked open. I pushed it gently. Inside was a small bedroom, its wallpaper faded and peeling. A dresser sat against one wall, drawers slightly ajar, and an old rocking chair faced the window. The chair was moving, back and forth, slow and steady. My breath caught. I stepped closer. No breeze stirred the curtains. The chair kept rocking. I whispered, "Hello?" Silence. Then a soft sobbing began. Quiet, mournful, unmistakably human. I spun around, heart pounding. The room was empty. I fled back to the parlor, locked the door, and sat down, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. But the sobbing didn't stop. It filled the room, growing louder, closer. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming up the stairs outside. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone, preparing to call for help. But there was no signal. The footsteps paused outside the parlor door. A knock. 1, 2, 3. Each knock was heavy, deliberate, echoing in the silent house. I held my breath. The door handle began to turn slowly. I scrambled to my feet, backed away. The door swung open. No one was there. But the temperature dropped sharply. Then a whisper in my ear, "Don't leave me." I stumbled backward, crashing into the fireplace. The whisper repeated, louder, more urgent. "Don't leave me." I grabbed my bag and ran for the front door. It was locked. I rattled the handle, panic rising. The whispers grew into cries, echoing down the hall. Suddenly the lights flickered on, blinding me. When my eyes adjusted, I saw her. A woman in a long dress, her eyes hollow, her face streaked with tears. She reached out a hand. "Stay with me." I turned and ran through the house, the sound of her footsteps chasing me. I burst through the front door into the cold night air and didn't stop running until I reached my car. The next day, I played back the voice recorder. Between static and silence, I heard the sobbing and a voice whispering, "Don't leave me alone." I never went back. Story the end. The late October air was already biting as I pulled into the gravel driveway of the old family cabin, nestled deep in the woods of upstate New York. It was the kind of place that was supposed to be a refuge from city life, a quiet retreat where one could recharge away from the noise and chaos. I had inherited the place from my grandfather, who passed away earlier that year. It had been sitting empty for months, and I finally decided to spend a weekend alone there before putting it up for sale. The cabin was small and rustic, wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and a wraparound porch that creaked underfoot. It sat on the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense pine and oak trees. I drove up in the late afternoon, hauling my bags inside, and set about lighting a fire in the hearth to chase away the damp chill that had settled over the place. At first, everything felt peaceful. The quiet of the woods was a balm after the nonstop hum of city life. I cooked a simple dinner on the gas stove and settled in with a book. The fading daylight slipped away, and soon the cabin was cloaked in darkness, save for the flickering firelight. I felt a small surge of pride for handling everything myself. No cell reception, no internet, no distractions. Just me and the woods. I went to bed early, the wooden bed frame creaking as I shifted under the heavy quilt. Outside, a steady wind whispered through the trees. The moon was a thin crescent, barely illuminating the clearing. Around 2 a.m., I woke suddenly to a faint sound. At first, I thought it might be the wind rattling a loose window pane. But as I lay still, I realized it was a soft tapping coming from somewhere inside the cabin. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to place it. The tapping was slow and deliberate, not the random noise of a branch scraping the siding, but something rhythmic. I told myself it was probably the old wood settling, or maybe the wind shifting a loose shutter. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the sound was purposeful. I pulled on my slippers and grabbed the small flashlight I kept on the nightstand. Cautiously, I got out of bed and moved toward the living room. The tapping stopped. The house was silent again, except for the steady crackling of the dying fire. I shone the flashlight around, checking the windows and doors. All were firmly closed and locked. As I turned to head back to bed, I heard it again. Tapping, this time coming from the back wall, near the kitchen. I stepped carefully into the kitchen, the wooden floor cold beneath my feet. The tapping persisted, slow and steady, like someone knocking lightly on the wall. I touched the cold surface of the paneling, trying to find the source. There was nothing there. The air in the room suddenly grew heavy, like a thick fog pressing down on me. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. My breath came out in shallow gasps. From behind me, I heard a soft creak, the unmistakable sound of a door opening. I spun around, flashlight beam darting across the room. The door to the cellar, usually kept shut tight, was slightly ajar. I hadn't touched it. I swallowed hard and approached, heart hammering. The cellar was dark, the steps descending into complete blackness. I debated calling out, but no words came. I reached for the door and closed it firmly, then locked it. The tapping stopped. I returned to bed, but sleep would not come. I lay awake, listening. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch outside, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth. In the morning, I rationalized the sounds. The old cabin was bound to make noises. The cellar door was probably loose, and the wind might have shifted it open. That day, I explored the surrounding woods, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But as dusk fell, the cabin seemed to grow darker and colder than before. That night, the power went out just after 9 p.m. The storm forecast had predicted clear skies, but heavy clouds rolled in unexpectedly. I lit candles and sat near the fire, my only light source flickering and casting shadows that danced on the walls. Around midnight, I heard it again, tapping on the back wall, slow and deliberate. I got up, this time more determined to find the cause. As I neared the kitchen, I noticed the candles flicker wildly, as if caught in a sudden gust of wind. But all the windows were closed. The tapping was louder now, almost urgent. Suddenly, the temperature dropped drastically. My breath became visible in the candlelight. From the corner of my eye, I caught a movement, a dark figure standing just beyond the doorway to the cellar. I froze, unable to move or speak. The figure didn't step forward, but I felt its gaze piercing me. Then a whisper, a faint, raspy voice, barely audible. "Leave." I barely heard the word, but it echoed through the room. I bolted back to the living room, grabbing my phone. No signal. Frantically, I tried to call the landlord, but the call wouldn't go through. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a low moan, rising and falling in the darkness. I wrapped myself in a blanket and stayed near the fire, trying to ignore the sounds. Hours passed. When dawn finally broke, the noises ceased. The morning light brought a fragile sense of safety. I decided to leave immediately. As I packed my bags, I glanced around the cabin one last time. Near the fireplace, I noticed faint handprints smeared in the dust on the mantel. I wiped them away, feeling a chill. Back in the city, I researched the history of the cabin. It turned out that decades earlier, a man who lived there alone had died mysteriously. Neighbors had reported strange noises and flickering lights around the cabin. Some said he never left, trapped by his own grief and anger. I never went back. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that tapping in my dreams. Story the end. The small town of Millbridge had always been a quiet place, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else and the streets fell silent long before midnight. I had lived there most of my life, and the familiarity of the place was comforting until that night. The night I spent alone in the old house at the edge of town, a night I still can't forget, no matter how much time has passed. The house was inherited by my family decades ago, a 2-story Victorian with peeling paint, creaky floors, and an attic that had always been off-limits. Growing up, I'd heard stories about the place. Whispers of strange noises, flickering lights, and shadows moving on their own. But they were just stories, tales parents told their children to keep them away from the attic or the basement. I never believed them. After college, I moved back to Millbridge to care for my aging grandmother, who lived in that very house. She had grown frail, and I took it upon myself to help out. One evening, she insisted I stay at her house alone for a few days while she went to visit a cousin out of state. I was hesitant, but agreed. The house felt empty without her, and as the night crept in, the silence settled thick and heavy. I arrived home late afternoon and unpacked a few things in the guest room. The house was dim, the last rays of sunlight filtering weakly through dusty windows. I turned on the lights and made myself a cup of tea in the kitchen, the aroma briefly masking the faint smell of mildew that clung to the old walls. By 9 p.m., I had settled in the living room with a book. The antique clock on the mantel ticked steadily, but there was an undercurrent of stillness that felt almost unnatural. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath. I tried to shake off the unease and lost myself in my book. Then, just after 10 p.m., the lights flickered once and went out. I jumped up and rushed to the breaker box in the basement, flashlight in hand. The basement was cold, damp, and smelled faintly of earth and something else, something I couldn't quite place. The fuse hadn't tripped. I flipped the switches up and down a few times and the lights buzzed back on. As I climbed back up the stairs, I heard it, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood coming from the attic hatch above. I froze on the landing, flashlight trembling in my hand. The attic door was firmly closed with an old rusty latch. No one else was in the house. I tried to tell myself it was just the house settling or a branch brushing the roof outside. But the sound came again, louder this time, slow, deliberate scraping. I climbed the stairs carefully and peered at the attic door. The latch was still secure. Curiosity wrestled with fear, and after a moment, I found a small screwdriver in a drawer and carefully unscrewed the latch. The door creaked open, revealing the dark space above. A faint chill spilled down the staircase. I shone my flashlight inside. The attic was filled with old boxes, moth-eaten furniture, and dust so thick it floated in the beam like tiny ghosts. But something else caught my eye. A small rocking chair near the far wall, moving slowly back and forth as if pushed by an invisible hand. My heart pounded. I called out softly, "Hello?" No answer. I stepped inside, the wooden floor creaking beneath my feet. The rocking chair continued to move rhythmically. I reached out and stopped it. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then I heard a faint whisper, barely audible, like a child speaking just beyond hearing. "Play with me." The words sent a chill down my spine. I whirled around, shining the flashlight into every corner, but there was nothing there. I ran down the stairs, slamming the attic door shut and relatching it. That night, I barely slept. Every creak, every groan of the old house sounded amplified. I kept the lights on, pacing the living room and trying to rationalize what I'd seen. Around 2 a.m., the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath came out in misty puffs. Then, from the kitchen, I heard the faint sound of a music box playing a slow, haunting melody. It was a tune I didn't recognize, but felt deeply unsettling. I grabbed my phone to call my grandmother, but hesitated. What would I say? That the house was haunted? The music stopped abruptly. Then footsteps began in the hallway outside the living room. Soft at first, then heavier, pacing back and forth. I stood frozen, listening to the sound of someone or something walking alone in the house with me. I called out, voice shaky, "Who's there?" Silence. Then a whisper right behind me. "Don't be afraid." I spun around. Nothing. For the next hour, the footsteps continued, the whispers overlapping, growing louder but never quite forming clear words. The air grew thick with cold and a strange sense of sorrow. When dawn finally broke, the house seemed to exhale, the shadows retreating with the morning light. I called my grandmother and told her I was coming over to stay with her until she returned. Later, I learned the house's history. Decades ago, a young girl named Emily had lived there, playing in that very attic. She died tragically, caught in a fire that consumed the upper floors, though the rest of the house remained intact. They say her spirit lingered, trapped by fear and longing. I never returned to that house alone at night again. Sometimes, though, when the wind is just right, I swear I can still hear the creak of the rocking chair and the soft whisper of a child's voice calling out from the darkness. Story the end. The night had a way of changing everything. When you were alone, especially in a place where shadows stretched long and silence pressed against your ears, even the most ordinary things could twist into something unfamiliar, even terrifying. Armin knew this better than most. He had worked the graveyard shift for years, often alone, in the sprawling municipal library on the edge of Dhaka. The building was an old relic from the colonial era, its stone walls thick and cold, windows tall and dusty, and corridors long enough to swallow any sound. He had taken the job for the quiet and the pay. Daytime shifts were crowded and noisy, but the night was peaceful, or so he thought. That particular night, Armin arrived just after 9, his bag slung over his shoulder and a bottle of water in hand. The library was nearly empty, save for a few students in the study rooms, their whispered voices muffled by thick walls. Armin's duties were simple: organize returned books, clean the reading rooms, and make sure the building was locked down by midnight. Sometimes, if he had the energy, he'd read himself, but mostly he used the night to think. Tonight, the air felt different, heavier, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The weather forecast had predicted rain, but the sky was clear, and the street lamps outside cast a golden glow over the empty parking lot. As he walked through the main hall, His footsteps echoed unnervingly, bouncing off marble floors and wooden shelves. Around 11:30 p.m., as Armand was sorting books in the history section, the overhead lights flickered briefly. Nothing unusual, he thought. Old wiring and the humidity often caused that. But then a soft whisper floated through the aisles. Armand paused, looking around. The library was silent, except for the hum of the air conditioning. He shook his head. Probably the wind playing tricks. He moved deeper into the stacks when the whispering grew louder, clearer. It wasn't just a sound, it was a voice. Low, barely audible, speaking in Bengali. Words he couldn't quite catch, but they felt urgent, desperate. "Who's there?" Armand called out softly. No answer. His pulse quickened. He tried to rationalize it. Maybe some students were still here, whispering in the study rooms. But the voice wasn't coming from any room. It was all around him, swirling through the stacks. He reached for his phone and flicked on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness between the shelves. No one. Armand felt a chill run down his spine. He decided to check the security monitors in the control room. If someone was in the building after hours, they were breaking the rules. The path to the control room was long and narrow, with rows of books towering on either side. The light flickered again, this time more aggressively, throwing shadows that danced on the walls. Armand's breath caught. The whispers seemed to follow him. He reached the control room, a cramped space filled with monitors showing various parts of the library. Most feeds were static. The cameras weren't all that good. As he scanned the screens, he noticed one camera feed flicker to static for a moment, then come back, but something was off. In the far corner of the basement storage room, a faint figure appeared. It was blurry and indistinct, but definitely human-shaped. Armand leaned in closer, heart pounding. The figure was standing still, facing the wall. He called out through the radio system, "Hello, security here. Please leave the premises." No response. He grabbed his flashlight and decided to investigate. The basement was accessed through a narrow staircase behind the reference section. The air grew cooler as he descended. The smell of damp earth and mildew filled his nostrils. He reached the storage room door and pushed it open. The flashlight beam revealed stacks of old books and filing cabinets covered in dust. The figure was gone. He called out again. Silence. He stepped inside, heart racing. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. Armand spun around and lunged for the handle, but it was stuck. He pulled harder, panicked. From the darkness came a cold breath on his neck. He froze. A whisper echoed, clearer than before, right behind his ear. "Help me." His skin prickled. He slammed his back against the door, and it suddenly swung open. Armand stumbled out into the stairwell, gasping. He didn't stop to think. He raced upstairs and locked the basement door behind him. He sat against the wall, trying to calm his breathing. The whispers had stopped. But something else remained, a heavy presence pressing down on him. Later, as the night wore on, Armand noticed the old library clock had stopped at 12:07 a.m. He tried to restart it, but it remained frozen. The next morning, the head librarian told Armand that the clock had been broken for years, and that 12:07 was the exact time a young librarian had died decades ago in a basement accident. Armand didn't believe in ghosts, but that night he swore he heard footsteps pacing outside his apartment window, even though the street was deserted. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he could still hear the faint whisper, "Help me," and the cold breath on his neck. Story the end. It was the kind of job that seemed perfect when I first took it. A night shift security position at a local library that was known for its rare collections and old architecture. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to cover rent and groceries while I figured out my next move. The library was a century-old building with creaky wooden floors, tall shelves packed with dusty books, and dim lighting that cast long shadows across every corner. On my first night, I arrived around 9:30 p.m. to meet the day guard, a friendly woman named Linda. She showed me the ropes, how to check the CCTV monitors, the schedule for my rounds, and the emergency procedures. The building had 2 floors open to the public, with a basement reserved for archives. I was told to avoid the basement at night. It was off limits due to fragile collections and, as Linda whispered with a nervous laugh, strange things that happened down there. I didn't pay much attention to that at the time. The first few hours were uneventful. I settled in the main security office, a small room near the entrance, and kept an eye on the security feeds. The library was quiet, silent, except for the occasional hum of the ventilation system or the distant creak of the building settling. I walked my rounds every 2 hours, checking the aisles and exits. Everything was as it should be. Around midnight, things started to shift. I was on the second floor near the history section when I felt an odd chill. The air grew colder, and my breath became visible in front of me. I rubbed my arms, but couldn't shake the cold. Then I heard it, a faint whispering like someone softly talking just beyond the next aisle. I stopped, straining to hear, but the whispers faded. I told myself it was just my imagination, the silence playing tricks on me. I moved on, finishing my rounds and returning to the office. About 2 hours later, I noticed something strange on the cameras. The feed from the basement archives flickered, the screen going black and white, then cutting out completely. I checked the backup camera but saw nothing but darkness. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a quick look. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the basement door. The stairwell was narrow and steep, and the light bulb overhead flickered ominously. When I reached the basement door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. That was impossible. It should have been locked. Pushing it open, I was hit by a blast of cold air. The basement was lined with rows of metal shelves packed with old manuscripts and boxes. The beam of my flashlight danced across the walls, revealing peeling paint and cobwebs. I called out, "Hello," but only silence responded. As I stepped further in, I heard the whispering again, this time clearer. It sounded like a woman softly repeating a name, "Eleanor. Eleanor." My heart pounded. I wasn't supposed to be here. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for my phone, using its light to find the stairs. I rushed back upstairs, locking the door behind me and trying to calm my racing heart. The next day, I told Linda about the basement door. She looked grave and warned me to never go down there again. "Eleanor was a librarian here over 100 years ago," she said softly. "There's a story that she died in the archives, and sometimes her spirit is said to wander the basement, searching for something she lost." I shrugged it off, but couldn't help feeling uneasy. That night around 3 a.m., I was reviewing the security footage when I saw something chilling. The hallway camera caught a shadowy figure moving silently past the history section. I zoomed in, but the image was blurry. It looked like a woman in an old-fashioned dress, her hair loose and flowing. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the hallway, but the corridor was empty. I called out, but no answer came. Suddenly, a book fell off a nearby shelf with a loud thud. I jumped and shone my flashlight on the floor. The book was old, its pages yellowed with age. I picked it up and opened it. It was a diary, written in elegant cursive. The entries spoke of Eleanor's life, her love for the library, her sorrow over a lost love, and hints of something hidden in the basement archives. I felt a chill and closed the diary quickly. That night, I couldn't sleep. The following nights were worse. Doors I had locked were found open, faint footsteps echoed in empty hallways, and the whispers grew louder. One night, I even heard soft crying near the basement stairwell. I started keeping a journal of my own experiences, hoping to make sense of what was happening. One evening, as I was making my rounds, I noticed a faint light coming from under the basement door. My heart raced. Was someone down there? I hesitated, but curiosity pulled me forward. I opened the door and stepped inside, the air cold and damp. The whispering was louder now, more urgent. "Find it! Find it!" I followed the sound to a corner where the shelves were densely packed. I ran my fingers over the spines until I found a small, leather-bound book tucked away behind other volumes. Opening it, I discovered a collection of letters, all addressed to Eleanor. They spoke of a secret meeting place in the basement and a hidden drawer in one of the old filing cabinets. I found the cabinet and pulled open the drawer. Inside was a faded photograph of a man and woman, Eleanor and her lost love, I assumed, and a small key. As I held the key, the temperature dropped suddenly, and I felt a presence behind me. I turned quickly, flashlight shining, but saw nothing. A whisper floated through the air. "Thank you." I left the basement, locking the door behind me and feeling a strange peace settle over the building. From that night on, the strange occurrences stopped. The whispers faded, the footsteps ceased, and the cold spots disappeared. I finished my contract at the library, but I still think about Eleanor and the secret she carried with her. Sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone, I hear a soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. Thank you. Story the end. It was a cold November evening when I started my new job at the old municipal office building. The city had outsourced some of their records maintenance to a third party, and I was hired as a temporary overnight archivist. The building itself was something out of a bygone era, built in the 1930s, with brick walls, narrow hallways, and a low ceiling that made every footstep sound exaggeratedly loud in the stillness of the night. I was told the day shift was hectic, but the night shift was peaceful, quiet enough to focus on the tedious task of scanning and digitizing documents. My first night alone there was unsettling, but nothing I couldn't explain away. The building was almost entirely empty after 7 p.m., the elevators didn't run, and I had to use the back staircase. As I set up my laptop and scanner in the archive room on the third floor, the silence pressed against me like a heavy blanket. Around 11 p.m., I took a break and stepped into the hallway to stretch my legs. The corridor lights flickered weakly, casting long shadows that danced on the faded wallpaper. I thought I heard faint footsteps echoing behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. The building groaned softly as if settling itself into the night. I chalked it up to nerves and old architecture. Returning to my work, I became engrossed in a collection of handwritten ledgers from the 1940s. The pages were yellowed, brittle, and smelled of musty paper and dust. Occasionally, the faint scuffling of something disturbed the silence, like soft footsteps in the distance, but I dismissed these as the building's old pipes or mice. At around 1 a.m., the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. My breath became visible in the chilled air, and the hairs on the back of my neck prickled. I looked around, but the door was closed and locked behind me. The HVAC system had shut off earlier, but the sudden cold felt unnatural. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. My phone was dead, forgot to charge it earlier, so I was left with only the faint glow of the emergency exit sign down the hall. That's when I heard the voice. It was soft and breathy, a whisper that seemed to come from all directions at once. Help me. My heart leapt into my throat. I spun around, desperately searching for the source. The sound echoed, faint and desperate. I fumbled for the flashlight app on my phone, but it wouldn't turn on. The whisper came again, clearer this time. Help me find it. I stumbled toward the door, hands outstretched. The doorknob was ice cold under my grip. I twisted it, but the door wouldn't budge. The whispers grew louder, overlapping voices now, all begging for help, pleading. Panic rose like bile in my throat. I banged on the door, yelling for someone, anyone. The lights flickered back on suddenly, and the room was empty. The temperature had normalized. I sat down shakily, breathing hard, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just exhaustion in my imagination. But then I noticed something odd on my desk. A small, dusty book I hadn't seen before, lying open. Its cover was faded leather, cracked with age. The title read, The Lost Records of Eastwood. I hadn't brought it in. I never saw it before. Curious and still shaken, I flipped through the pages. It contained handwritten entries about missing persons, old city secrets, and strange disappearances. One page caught my eye. A detailed account of a young woman named Mary Eastwood, who had worked at this very building in the early 1940s. She had disappeared one night under mysterious circumstances. The official report claimed she never left the building after hours, but was never found. Some believed she was trapped inside, others whispered of something darker. I glanced around the room uneasily. The whispers returned, softer now, almost pleading. Find the truth. I decided to investigate further, paging through the book late into the night. Suddenly, a cold breeze brushed past me, though all windows and doors were sealed. And a shadow passed across the wall, a figure in an old-fashioned dress, her face blurred but eyes unmistakably sad. I froze, heart pounding, unable to look away. The figure raised a trembling hand and pointed toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner. I approached cautiously and tried the lock. To my surprise, it clicked open easily. Inside were a series of files labeled Confidential. I pulled out a file marked with Mary Eastwood's name. Inside were letters, notes, and a journal. Reading the journal, I learned Mary had uncovered something terrible. an illegal scheme involving city officials embezzling funds during the war. She had planned to expose them, but had been silenced. Her last entry spoke of fear and a plan to hide proof somewhere in the building. My skin crawled. As I read the last line, the room went icy again. A soft sob echoed, and I heard footsteps pacing behind me. I turned to see the ghostly figure again, closer this time. Her lips moved, mouthing the words, "Find it." My eyes darted around, searching for the hidden proof. Suddenly, I spotted a loose floorboard beneath the cabinet. Kneeling, I pried it open with trembling hands. Inside was a small metal box. I opened it to reveal ledgers and documents exposing the corruption Mary had discovered. At that moment, the ghost smiled faintly. The room warmed slightly. The sobbing ceased, the lights steadied, and then she was gone. I closed the box carefully and left it on the desk. The front door was unlocked now, and I stepped outside into the early morning light. I knew I couldn't keep this secret. I contacted the local authorities and handed over the documents. Mary Eastwood's story was finally told. After that night, I never worked alone in the building again, but sometimes when I pass by the old municipal office, I swear I hear faint footsteps and a soft whisper carried on the wind. Thank you. Story the end. It was almost 11 p.m. when I finally turned off the television and stood up from the couch. I had dozed off watching some forgettable late-night crime show, and the static hum of the credits rolling had snapped me out of the half-dream haze. My apartment was quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of old wooden floorboards settling. I lived alone in a second-floor unit of a 3-story building that had probably been built sometime in the 60s. No insulation, thin walls, and creaky everything. I was used to the noise. After 3 years of solo living in that place, I knew which creaks belonged to the building and which ones didn't. That night, something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt heavier. The temperature had dropped suddenly, making me pull my hoodie tighter around my body as I walked toward the kitchen for a glass of water. As I passed the window in the hallway, I noticed the blinds were swaying gently, even though none of the windows were open. I stopped and stared. The blinds were barely moving, like someone had just passed their hand through them. I chalked it up to a draft. I wasn't in the mood to scare myself. In the kitchen, I poured the water and leaned against the counter, sipping slowly and staring into the darkened living room. I didn't bother turning on any more lights. I was planning to go to bed anyway. I turned off the kitchen light and started walking toward my bedroom. As I passed the hallway again, I saw it, a figure, in the window. At first, I thought it was a reflection of some kind, but it wasn't. The blinds were partially closed, slanted downward, but between the gaps, I could see 2 eyes looking straight in. I froze. I felt the air rush out of my lungs. There was no balcony outside that window, no ledge to stand on, just a sheer drop to the street below. My building's hallway window looked over the side alley. No one could stand there unless they were levitating or hanging from something. But those eyes, they weren't afraid. They looked bored or patient. I didn't move for what felt like a full minute. I just stared, expecting the figure to blink or vanish or prove itself to be some trick of light. But it didn't. I stepped forward slowly, wanting to get a closer look, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. As I got within a few feet of the window, the figure backed away. No footsteps, no motion, just disappeared, like mist pulled into the wind. I stared out, my breath fogging the glass, trying to see anything in the alley below. Nothing. It was pitch dark, no movement, no shadows. That's when I heard the door to my bedroom creak open. I live alone. My heart pounded in my ears as I turned around and stared down the short hallway toward the bedroom. The door was cracked open about a foot. I remembered shutting it when I left that morning. I'm weirdly obsessive about doors being closed when I'm gone. I have no idea why. I walked slowly toward the door, listening. Nothing but the sound of my own breath and the slight creak of the floor. I reached out and nudged the door open with my foot. The room was dark. I hit the light switch. Nothing. The bulb had blown, or maybe the circuit had tripped. Either way, I was now standing in the doorway of my dark bedroom, no weapon, and the image of someone's face still burned in my mind. I flicked my phone flashlight on and scanned the room. Nothing. Closet door closed, window latched, no sign of intrusion. I even looked under the bed. Empty. I forced myself to breathe. Maybe I was overtired. Maybe the face in the window was just a shadow. And the door, I could have forgotten to close it, despite what I thought. I changed quickly and got into bed, phone on the nightstand, flashlight off, but I couldn't sleep. I kept listening, waiting for something. Around 1:13 a.m., I heard tapping, not from outside, from the inside of my bedroom closet. It was faint, barely audible, but definitely rhythmic. 3 slow taps, pause, 3 more. I stared at the closet door. It hadn't moved. I sat up in bed and listened. Tap, tap, tap. I turned on my phone light again, this time holding it like a weapon as I slid out of bed and stepped toward the closet. I told myself it was probably a mouse or something. The building had issues before, but I knew better. I wasn't hearing scratching or scurrying. I was hearing taps, knuckles on wood. I yanked the closet door open. Nothing, just clothes and boxes. I even moved things around with the flashlight on. Nothing alive, nothing unusual. But when I stood back up, I saw it in the corner of the room. A figure, standing completely still, back to me. My heart stopped. I hadn't heard anything. I hadn't seen anyone enter. But there it was, tall, motionless, black as tar, facing the wall. It looked like a man, but distorted. Its limbs were too long, its head too low. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. I stumbled back, hitting my dresser, sending a bunch of items clattering to the floor. I turned to run and flicked on the hallway light as I bolted out of the room. The hallway light flickered once, then went out. I ran to the living room and grabbed my phone charger. I had enough sense to plug it in and keep the screen brightness up. I was going to call 911, but I had no signal, no bars, just the spinning wheel and a red no service warning at the top. I turned the Wi-Fi on. Nothing. The router was in the corner, blinking as if it was working. I unplugged it and plugged it back in. Still nothing. That's when I saw the reflection in the TV screen, behind me, standing at the entrance to the hallway. I turned around fast, swinging the flashlight. Again, nothing. No figure. No movement. Just that heavy silence and that thick, cold air. I left the apartment. I didn't care. I ran down the stairs barefoot, wearing nothing but my sleep clothes, holding my phone like a shield. I made it to the street and kept going, only stopping when I was a few blocks away. Eventually, I got a signal. I called a friend. He lived 10 minutes away. I didn't tell him everything, just enough that I didn't feel safe in my place and needed to crash at his. The next day, we went back together. Everything was in place. Nothing broken, no signs of forced entry. We checked the closet again, empty. The window, locked. My router, working fine. Phone signal, back to normal. But I couldn't unsee what I saw. And I never heard tapping again, not physically. It came in dreams after that, always the same rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. I moved out 2 weeks later. I tried to forget it, tried to tell myself it was a hallucination brought on by exhaustion or stress, until a month ago when I got an envelope in the mail. No return address, just a photo inside. It was a grainy picture of my old hallway window taken from outside, and in the corner, reflected in the glass, a face watching me. Story the end. I took the night shift because I needed the money. That was the only reason. I had just moved to a small, almost forgotten town in western Pennsylvania, trying to escape a string of bad decisions and unpaid bills back in Philly. My cousin knew a guy who knew a guy, and somehow I landed a job as a night watchman at an old municipal building downtown. It was one of those stone structures built in the early 1900s. Tall arches, creaking floors, and massive wooden doors that looked like they belonged on a castle more than a town hall. My job was straightforward. Patrol the building twice every hour, check that all the doors were locked, the lights were off, and that no one was trespassing. The building was technically still in use during the day, housing some legal offices, a small courtroom, and storage for Old Town records. At night, it was supposed to be completely empty. Just me, the lights humming overhead, and the kind of silence that presses down on your eardrums. My first few nights were uneventful. I listened to music on my earbuds, walked the halls, and even read a book during the slower hours between rounds. The place gave off a weird vibe, but I chalked that up to its age. Old buildings settle and groan. Everyone knows that. But by the 4th or 5th night, I started noticing things. Small things, barely worth mentioning at first. One night around 1 a.m., I passed by the courtroom and thought I heard whispering. Not loud, just soft and rhythmic, like someone praying under their breath. I opened the door quickly and flipped on the light. The room was empty, of course, just rows of wooden benches and the elevated judge's stand. The sound stopped immediately. I figured it had to be the heating system or maybe wind through a cracked window. But I checked. Everything was sealed tight. Then the elevator started moving on its own. That same night, around 2:45 a.m., I was sitting in the security room watching the monitors. Most of the cameras were black and white and grainy, but I could still make out movement. I glanced up and noticed the elevator cam had turned on. The screen showed the doors opening slowly on the third floor, the top floor where the historical records were kept. No one had pressed a button, no one got in or out. It just opened, paused, then closed again. I grabbed my flashlight and went up. The hallway was empty, all the lights off, the air colder than it should have been. I checked the elevator. Nothing. No malfunction either. The panel was still lit, functioning like normal. The weirdness kept piling up. I started finding doors open that I'd sworn were locked minutes earlier. The scent of smoke would drift through the halls, even though no one was allowed to smoke inside the building. And then there was the voice. It happened during the third week. I was in the basement storage room doing my last round of the night. It was damp down there, always smelling like mildew and rust. Rows and rows of old metal shelves lined the room, filled with files and boxes, most so brittle they looked like they'd crumble if you touched them. I was halfway through when I heard a woman's voice say, "Don't turn around." I froze. My first instinct was that someone had followed me in. Maybe a squatter or someone who knew the layout better than me. I turned anyway, fast, shining my flashlight in every direction. No one. The voice had been right behind me, not from the hallway, not muffled. Right behind my left shoulder, close enough that I felt the breath against my ear. I backed out of the basement, not caring if I finished my round. I told myself it was in my head. Maybe I was overtired, stressed. Maybe someone left a radio on or a recording. But there was no radio down there. Just dust, old papers, and the echo of my own panic. I almost quit that night. Almost. But I needed the paycheck. Rent was due, and I didn't want to go crawling back to Philly like a failure. The following night, I brought a small digital recorder with me. I figured if there were voices, I'd catch them, prove to myself something was really going on. Most of my shift was quiet. Nothing out of the ordinary. But just after 3 a.m., the air changed. It's hard to explain. It felt thicker, colder, like I had walked into a different part of the building without realizing it. I was on the second floor, near the legal archives. I had the recorder in my hand, turned on and recording. I felt something pass behind me. A breeze, even though all the windows were shut. And then that voice again. Faint, barely above a whisper. "Why are you still here?" I turned fast, but no one was there. I checked every room, every closet. Nothing. I played back the recording later in the security office. I could hear my own footsteps, the soft creak of the wood beneath me, and then the voice, clear as day. A woman's voice, whispering the same question I had heard. That night, I left early. Didn't even clock out. I didn't come back for 2 nights. Called in sick. My supervisor didn't ask many questions. Night guards didn't last long at that job. Turnover was high, even though no one ever talked about why. I finally convinced myself to return. I told myself I needed to be rational. Ghosts weren't real. Maybe someone was screwing with me. I bought a small motion sensor and set it up in the basement, just inside the doorway. If anything moved in there, I'd know. Halfway through my shift, I got the alert. The sensor pinged. Something had passed in front of it. I went down with my flashlight and found the basement exactly how I left it. No open boxes, no dragged footprints in the dust. But the sensor had been triggered. I played the camera feed from the hallway. It showed the door opening, slowly, as if nudged from the inside, but no one walked out. The footage didn't sit right with me. The door opened in such a smooth, deliberate way, no wind would have done that. And if it had been a person, they'd have shown up on the footage. That morning after my shift, I asked one of the day staff if anything strange had ever happened there. She was a cleaning lady, mid-60s maybe, named Judy. She looked at me for a long time before answering. "I don't go down to the basement anymore," she said. "Not after what happened to Craig." I asked who Craig was. "Other night guy, year or 2 back, quiet kid, said he was hearing voices, seeing shadows. Then one morning, he didn't come out. Police found him in the basement, back corner. said it looked like he'd had a heart attack, but he was only 30. She didn't say anything else, just walked away. That night, I brought salt. I didn't know what I was doing, just remembered something from an old movie about protection. I poured a thin line of it across the threshold of the basement door, just in case. I also brought a small crucifix, even though I wasn't religious. It hung on a necklace that belonged to my mother. Around 2:30 a.m., the lights started flickering. Not just in one part of the building, all of them. A wave of darkness would roll through the hallways, followed by a low hum like the building itself was groaning. I ran to the control room. All the monitors were static. All except one, the basement camera. It was showing the back wall of the basement, where all the shelves were stacked to the ceiling. But there was someone standing there. A woman. Long, dark hair, pale face, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. She was just staring at the wall, unmoving. I stared at the monitor, heart racing, waiting for her to turn around. But she never did. She just stood there, head slightly tilted, like she was listening to something on the other side of that wall. Then the feed cut to black. I refused to go down there. I sat in the office, locked the door, and waited until daylight. I didn't even do my rounds. I didn't care anymore. When the morning guard came in, I handed him my keys and told him I quit. 2 days later, I got a call from Judy. She had heard I left. She said she wasn't surprised, said no one lasted longer than a month at that post. I asked her if she knew who the woman was, the one on the monitor. She got quiet. There used to be a hospital in town, she said finally. Before they built the courthouse back in the 1930s, a psychiatric ward, burned down. People say some of the foundation was used for the municipal building. My mother said there was a woman there, institutionalized for years, refused to speak, died in a fire that took out half the building. Some say she never left. I moved out of that town 2 weeks later. I've never taken another night shift job since, and I've never forgotten that voice, right behind me in the dark, saying not to turn around. But the worst part is I did. And now sometimes, even in new cities, new apartments, I still hear footsteps behind me when I know I'm alone. I still feel cold air against my neck when all the windows are closed. I still catch glimpses in the reflection of darkened TV screens or mirrors just behind my shoulder of a pale woman staring, and I know she's still with me. Story the end.